Yo, what's up, everybody? Today is March 9th, 2025. Fucking daylight savings times.
Yeah, what a stupid idea. Losing an hour of sleep randomly.
It's so fucking stupid.
Another of America's great ideas, thanks Ben Franklin.
Yeah, like so fucking dumb. Anyway, this is Real Sankara Hours, a Pan-African socialist political podcast where we talk about domestic global politics, race from basically a Pan-African socialist perspective. So independent black-owned media, which is definitely relevant in times like these. So Real Sankara Hours, this is us. Today is March 9th, 2025. This is a free episode.
Is it? I thought this was a Patreon.
We had a free episode. The last one was a bonus.
Oh. All right.
It's okay. This is a free episode. But if you want access to bonus content, speaking of which, you can become a patron at patreon.com/realsankarahours. Everything will be like, if you look at the description of this episode, the podcast description, all our links are right there. But patreon.com/realsankarahours, you can get access to bonus content for $5 a month. So half of our episodes are free. The other half is bonus content, where we're trying to, what we've done historically is do a lot of black radical political theory reading, and we definitely want to get back to that. So, but we have a massive backlog of bonus episodes. If you're a new listener, if you're a patron for $5 a month, you can have access to that. So, like, some of the stuff we've read and discussed is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. So, yeah, we did a deep dive on that in a couple of our bonus episodes, like a while ago. So, yeah, that's something that you'll have access to if you're a patron for $5 a month. Patreon.com/realsankarahours. If you look at the description of this podcast, the show notes and all that, all our links are right there, and our website is realsankarahours.org. So again, if you look at the show notes in the description of this podcast, everything is laid out right there to stay up to date with what we're doing, and obviously to access bonus content. Anyway, with that out of the way, my name is Adam Hudson. I'm one of your co-hosts for Real Sankara Hours.
And this is Peter MGunn.
Yeah, so let's get into it. So today's March 9th. So there was a unprecedented, I don't know what to call it, like verbal fisticuffs, like in the Oval Office between President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
The guy who owes us $150 billion.
Yeah, it was kind of like this, I guess, like little shout. I don't know how to describe it. I've heard it described as a shouting match. I think of it as like a verbal fisticuffs, like, you know. And basically Trump was like, you're not being grateful. You're not being grateful, because essentially, they were there to discuss like the prospect of a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. And one of the things that was on the table, Zelensky wants obviously more military support from the United States. The Trump administration wants access to Ukraine's minerals, and from what I read, I'll have to double check this, but obviously I'll put some information in the show notes. If I recall correctly, I believe Zelensky was the one who put this item on the table. Essentially, like, giving the U.S. access to Ukraine's minerals in return for further U.S. military support. But for sure, this is something that Donald Trump wants. He wants access to, given the U.S. having access to Ukraine's minerals. But But so anyway, so what's on? So basically, yeah, there's the prospect of a potential ceasefire. Maybe, we don't know, between Russia and Ukraine. But obviously Zelensky, was telling the Trump administration, like, hey, basically like not to trust Russia. And so yeah, they got into it. And I've been paying attention to Ukraine, but not as in depth, but obviously it's still in the news, but
it's always in the news.
Yeah.
It was a bit of a sunning almost, or at least that was the way they thought about it, because part of the thing is that, like, this time around, like, the Trump administration doesn't give a fuck, and, they are America, so
right.
Under Biden, it's like, oh, NATO and the Atlantic alliance is back, and, the amount of, like, Ukraine flags everywhere, and liberals especially, are so into this war because it's so righteous, and it's so, America's finally on the right side of a global conflict, and Putin is the most evil person in history, and all that stuff. So, but really, like, what it boils down to is that, America is, like, one of the fakest friends imaginable, and we treat Ukraine like it's a third world country. Like, a lot of the outrage is basically because Ukraine is in Europe, but the way we've been treating it, we don't really draw a distinction between that and, like, a poor country in the third world. And that's what I think a lot of liberals have a hard time piecing together, because, ultimately, like, we've been funding this war, and, basically without America's support, it's not really going to continue. Like, Europe was scrambling to be like, how could you do this, America? How could you give up on Europe? But then I was like, well, are you guys going to send troops? Like, nah. I think the UK, Keir Starmer, is stupid enough to try and do it. But, I mean, it does suck in the sense that, like, it is an aggressive war on behalf of Russia, and I'm not defending their actions.
Right. Yeah. Same. Yeah. We're not here to defend Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. So
at the same time, you have to understand, sort of, like, going back to the Maidan in 2014, sort of the way the United States and NATO has sort of played with Ukraine and given it a lot of false promises, because it is basically they call it the breadbasket of Europe because of all the agricultural lands, but it is also a basket case. Like, sort of the way that the U.S. sort of strategically disinvested in, like, all of the former communist countries, Ukraine has been, like, the most severe, and their economy is a total basket case. And I mean, it was, like, very developed in the Soviet Union, but it basically dismantled all of that, and it is a client state that, like, we're, like, openly looting, like, on the level of, like Hunter Biden and all that stuff. Like, we just take everything. And then, like, Zelensky was actually elected on, like, a pro-peace platform because, initially, like, not every Ukrainian's a hardcore Ukrainian nationalist, and the ones that are usually have some Nazi sympathies, putting it lightly. And, America doesn't like to talk about that, but that's sort of the breakdown, because there's a lot of Russian speakers, especially in the eastern part of Ukraine, and they're not, they were never too keen on the war with Russia. But at this point, like, Ukraine is, like, running out of men, like,
yeah,
like, they're running out of the ability to, like, continue to fight the war on their own behalf. And so, and Russia has just sort of been very methodically, like, taking land. And it's true that there is no deal that's going to come that doesn't involve Ukraine giving up territory. But go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, just to add, I just want to kind of correct. I'm not finding. So I'm not sure. So when I said like Zelensky was the one who put offer the minerals on the table, I'm not finding information to confirm that. So I just want.
I mean, he basically kind of does what the U.S. tells him to.
Yeah, and so I will say though, like, there is this article in the BBC. What minerals does Ukraine have, and what are they used for? So just to give, people some context in terms of like what kind of minerals Ukraine actually has. So titanium, zirconium, graphite, rare earth, lithium. So lithium, they have some lithium, which is very crucial, especially for
Elon Musk.
Yeah, Elon Musk and lithium batteries for like electric vehicles. So actually, apparently, according to this BBC article, Ukraine is home to 1/3 of all European lithium deposits. So, which is a key component in like current batteries. Other elements, uranium. So that's crucial for nuclear weapons. There's also copper, lead, zinc, silver, nickel, cobalt, manganese, rare earth minerals. I believe I said graphite, and titanium. Ukraine has 5% of the world's critical raw materials. So, and as Peter mentioned, it's also, home to a lot of Europe's agriculture, especially grain. So, and also on top of like about Ukraine and their troops, there's a lot of soldiers have been deserting the Ukrainian military. So a lot of troops are deserting. So they're just a lot of Ukrainians are kind of just give up on the fight. I was listening to this podcast episode on Chapo Trap House, and they were talking to Mark Ames, journalist Mark Ames, and he mentioned that like a lot of Ukrainian soldiers in the Ukrainian military are basically treated like shit. So the troop morale in Ukraine is pretty low.
It's World War I out there. It's old school trench warfare.
Yeah.
Which is, it's kind of sick the way some people are like, the people that got really mad that they didn't like get to be a part of World War II, they love this war because it's got all the great hits of that stuff, but it's fucking brutal.
Yeah.
And the question is more just like, exactly how long do we want this to continue? And the United States, their idea was like, oh shit, Russia, they're going to lay a trap for Russia and Russia's going to fall for it. And then we're going to, sanction the fuck out of them and destroy their economy and just bleed them dry, kind of Vietnam style or Afghanistan style, like we did in the 80s. But Russia kind of spent the past decade or so sort of preparing itself, insulating itself in a way that like the sanctions haven't really worked. Russia's still chugging along. Putin's not like in danger of his regime collapsing or anything like that. So really the issue is just like America doesn't want to admit that it fucked up or did anything wrong. So it doesn't mind sacrificing another couple 100,000 Ukrainians to the cause of being the champions of democracy, even though Zelensky is never going to have another election. It is kind of like South Vietnam in that sense. Like South Vietnam was supposed to be this like a champion of democracy, but like the guys we had in there were all dictators. And Zelensky, he's not like cut from that cloth. He was literally a TV actor, but he plays the role that America wants him to play, even though we keep messing around, but really the difference is that Trump's an old school imperialist. He doesn't care about human rights or democracy, so he's just kind of like, wait, so what are we doing? And also, like Mark Ames said, who's really like Radio Warner, just really kind of the go-to if you want in-depth stuff on Ukraine. Russiagate, like Trump hasn't forgotten about Russiagate, and he's not inclined to be particularly nice to Ukraine, and he just looks at it like, we're putting all this money into this thing and we're not getting anything out of it, so like we want the minerals. Or he's like, what does Ukraine even have that we can take to get something back for this? And so that's kind of where it comes from, because it's not like these mines aren't developed or whatever, like this isn't, so they have to like actually build this stuff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that's the thinking. And also, I mean, yeah, Putin was nice to him. Like, you have to understand that this is like the most narcissistic form of the American empire. And when you're trying to figure out Trump, a lot of it's really just not that deep. It's like, these people were nice to him, so he's inclined to play ball with them, and these people were mean to him, so he's like, no. And he doesn't care about the long-term stability of the empire. I mean, because if he did, like NATO's we get a great return on investment in keeping NATO going. Like, it's great for American empire. But people don't look at it like that, because there's the isolationist streak that, that goes back in sort of American reactionary thinking, back like the America First slogan was pretty popular in the late 30s, and it was basically the kind of a similar idea in the sense of like, well, we don't really care what's going on in Europe, they can fight it out. But also underneath that, for a lot of America First people, was like, well, we don't really care what that guy in Germany's doing, and we actually kind of support it. And there are some people who do take that view of Putin. They're like, yeah, he's a strong man, and
yeah,
that's the kind of thing we like. But the overall the overall like interest of NATO is to keep Russia down, and always like excluded from the civilized world or whatever. But the problem is, like, when you come back down to it, it's like you can't really, like, Russia is part of Europe, and it is in Europe's interest to eventually like integrate it into whatever thing that they're doing over there, the EU or whatever, if Europe cares about being functional. But kind of seems like they don't. So it's in the defense contractors' interest to keep this war going. So honestly, like, probably Trump's not going to cut. Like, the war is going to still go on, probably. It's just we're going to be we're going to want a lot more from Ukraine in exchange for it.
Yeah, and actually, it's what you just said, Peter, reminded me of this recent speech by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Like, I think if you guys haven't listened to Jeffrey Sachs, like, I highly suggest you listen to him. Like, he's pretty good. And anyway, he gave a speech to the European Parliament on February 21st, and essentially his main point, his thesis, was that Europe needs an independent foreign policy, and that essentially, basically Europe has become America's lapdog via NATO. And I'm gonna read like the video description of it. It's pretty good. Renowned Professor Jeffrey Sachs said, when the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union ended in 1991, the view became even more exaggerated. The view is that we, the U.S., run the show, which is true. We will clean up from the former Soviet Union. We will take out any remaining Soviet-era allies. Countries like Iraq, Syria, and so forth will go. And we've been experiencing this foreign policy for essentially 33 years. Europe has paid a heavy price for this because Europe has not had any foreign policy during this period. No voice, no unity, no clarity, no European interest, only American loyalty. He added that the European Union should be the main trading partner of Russia. Europe and Russia have complementary economies. The fit for mutually beneficial trade is very strong. The Trump administration is imperialist at heart. Trump obviously believes that the great powers dominate the world. The U.S. will be ruthless and cynical, and yes, also vis-a-vis Europe. Don't go begging to Washington. That won't help. Instead, have a true and independent European foreign policy. Which I think, like, I have somewhat mixed feelings because, like, Europe still has its own neo-colonial interests, especially in Africa. So, I totally agree with Jeffrey Sachs that, yeah, Europe has long, like, since sucked up to Washington since the end of the Cold War. And again, this is not a defense of Russia's invasion of Ukraine or Putin, but, you know, this historical context does need to be laid out that after the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union, Russia disbanded the Warsaw Pact, right? But rather than disbanding NATO after the Cold War, NATO only expanded. And it is true, like, since the end of the Cold War, the view of American foreign policy thinkers and planners, like, basically the people who run the U.S. empire, their view is that, okay, now the U.S. dominates the world now. The U.S. is running the show, which also means in Europe. So even though Europe, like, especially, you know, Western Europe, like Britain, France, like, you know, these are all former empires who've lost their colonies. And part of I think a significant reason why there's a strong relationship between particularly the UK and the United States, that so-called special relationship, is because the UK still wants to be part of Western imperialism. Even though the UK obviously no longer has its colonies, there's still the Commonwealth, right? The UK still has a fucking Commonwealth. The UK wants to have its fun too when it comes to empire. So does France. And particularly these Western European countries, I think when they go alongside with whatever the US wants, for them it's like they get to relive their colonial era days, right? So I have a little bit of mixed feelings when it comes to Europe having its own foreign policy, because particularly those former European colonizers, they still have their neo-colonial interests, right? So there's that. But at the same time, this is where I think Jeffrey Sachs is at like 1,000% correct, is that I do think, yeah, the EU should be a trading partner of Russia, and that Europe should integrate Russia as part of larger Europe, because, yeah, Russia is in Europe. Obviously, most of Russia is in Asia, right? But Russia is still part of Europe, and I do think going forward, Europe should find a way to integrate Russia as part of Europe, and I think because when I heard that speech, when he was talking, I was like, okay, yeah, to me it makes sense. Like, in terms of a long-term future for international peace and international stability, I think it makes total sense for Russia to be integrated into the larger Europe, in that it doesn't make sense for their, like, this animosity and this enmity between Europe and the West and Russia just doesn't make sense. Regardless of one's feelings about Putin as a leader and his actions, just Russia in general as a country and as an economy, it doesn't make sense to keep further isolating Russia. Again, this is not to, justify Putin's actions, but I think it is very clear that that's been the strategy for the past like 30 plus years since the end of the Cold War, and that has not done anyone any good.
And Jeffrey Sachs is a very well versed on this subject, because he was one of the chief architects of the shock therapy regime that Harvard essentially imposed on Russia and completely destroyed its economy in the 90s, which basically created the conditions for Putin to be Putining it up. But the real problem is with European integration with Russia, especially when it comes down to natural gas, because, you know, that is like a very easy thing for Russia, for Europe, and especially Germany to like hook up to Russia's natural gas. But American fossil fuel companies don't like that, because right now we've got Europe paying way more to ship our natural gas all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe, which, you know, I mean, from a climate perspective, I mean, imperialism is like one of the main drivers of climate change. And I think in this context, it's like the most stark, because a lot of it does come down to gas, because it's in our interest to keep Europe dependent. Like, that's kind of the main sort of natural resource export that Europe is dependent on us for, and we don't want, because, you know, that's what the Nord Stream pipeline, which is what kind of a lot of the subtext of this Ukraine stuff is about, and that's why it's so funny, that's why you know, sort of the DC foreign policy blob freaks out so much about Trump, is that, like, it's like he doesn't get it. He doesn't, you know, he's fucking up the bag for America.
Because a lot of the, like, actually Chris Hedges put it a really good way in an interview with Mark Lamont Hill, that essentially the 2024 election was between corporatists and oligarchs. Basically corporatists, like basically the Democratic Party, and even many, I would say, conventional Republicans, is that like they just want stability with a global capitalist system, right? Whereas oligarchs, people like Trump and Elon Musk and Steve Bannon, basically they want to destroy the administrative state and privatize everything and put basically like a toll system on everything we fucking need. So like, you know, like especially with all these fucking streaming services, you have to keep paying a fucking subscription, and the prices keep going up, but the quality is ass, right? Like the quality for like a lot of streaming is just complete dog shit, right? Like even like today, the days of streaming now, like especially as like, you know, both you and I, Peter, like we're millennials born in the late 80s, like, you know, I feel like for people like our age, it would kind of make us a little bit nostalgic for the days of cable, because like cable is relatively fucking cheaper than like the shit we have to pay now for fucking streaming services, right? But yeah, like they want to privatize like these kind of right-wing oligarchs, people like Musk and Trump and Bannon they basically want to gut the administrative state and then have everything from like fucking water to education just be privatized, and we pay a fucking toll and a fee for services, while the quality of the services we actually fucking need, like the quality will just go down the shitter. But meanwhile, they'll just make people pay up the ass because we fucking need that, right? So the right-wing oligarchs, like that's what they want. Like that's what all that's what Project 2025 is about, is to basically like, you know, weaken and gut the administrative state. But then but the thing is, that administrative state, right? That administrative state is meant to make the empire stable, right? Like that is why, like on the one hand, there's one function of the administrative state, which is to provide services that everyone needs, like education, National Institutes of Health, right? Like things that are being gutted that we actually fucking need, like the park system, So there's that end of the administrative state. That's why, like, I'm gonna be honest, I don't consider myself an anarchist anymore. Like, especially as a socialist, I actually do think like a socialist society does need a state. Like, you do need an administrative state. Like, if you want people to have access to healthcare, to provide for people's needs, like having an administrative state like serves a function, right? So that's like, for if you want to get deep into like, left-wing political theory, right? Like, so people on the more anarchist to libertarian socialist end, like, they basically want to get rid of the state but replace it with something else, like basically more like decentralized, like workers communes and stuff like that. But the thing is, like, in order to provide like for the overall infrastructure and services that like benefit everybody, the public and the working class, having an administrative state actually does make sense, right? So that's one function of the administrative state, is to actually administer shit that people need on a day-to-day fucking basis, right? Like, so, like when it comes to roads, right? You need some sort of administrative state to make sure the roads get fucking paved, right? Or to make sure like the trains run on time, or like subway stations. You do need some administrative state to make sure shit runs on time and that people's everyday needs to make life more livable, like, that is met, right? So there's that. But then there's the other function of the administrative state in a capitalist empire like the United States, is that there's other functions of the administrative state, which is basically to maintain the empire, right? And corporatists and like particularly the Democratic Party and mainstream Republicans, they want that administrative state apparatus because they benefit from the stability of the international capitalist system, because they have long-term investments in it when it comes to global trade and all that type of shit. But Trump is coming in there, well, like Elon Musk literally is coming in with a fucking chainsaws, and they're like, yeah, we're just gonna destroy everything. Fuck it. Yeah, fuck Department of Education. Fuck it. Just fuck everything. Right? They're just blowing this shit up. So in return, they want to just basically privatize everything. That's what fucking Doge is about, and that's why Elon Musk is getting such a fucking hard on every time he gets to like cut something, because he's like, oh yes, I got to like, he gets to just fucking like, yeah, I got to privatize everything. Like, it's just I fucking hate Elon Musk so much. Like, every time I hear his voice, I'm so fucking angry. Like, his voice is, I hate him so much.
Yeah,
I hate him. I hate him so much. Fuck him.
Goddamn Afrikaner. I will say, and this is about as much as I will say about it, is that I have a hard time accepting a world where his life does not end with his head in a guillotine. I've never seen a more guillotinable head in my entire life. But, it's true that if there are any anarchists in this equation, they're on the right. I mean, sort of, and this is much more pervasive this time around in the Trump administration, because you've got sort of the Peter Thiel informed thinking, which comes from the quote-unquote dark enlightenment, which are like the bad boys of Silicon Valley, which read all the cyberpunk literature of the 90s and are like, yeah, we want to do that. And they almost don't believe in states. They want to destroy, like, in their like sort of fever dream fantasy, they do want to dismantle the state and just have everything be corporate fiefdoms, and they think that they can pull it off. And that's that's why Trump's supporting charter cities. I mean, they've got literally one like set up in Honduras that Honduras like elected another leftist president, and they're like they want to get rid of the charter city that Peter Thiel basically set up in Honduras, and we might have to coup Honduras again because of that. But that's basically like the long-term goal. It's completely privatized fiefdom. Like they don't the Atlanticist, like liberal imperialist, somewhat Keynesian state that came out of World War II that has served America so well, that entire framework. They really do want to get rid of it, like far past, because even like the Department of Education thing, that's been like a Heritage Foundation's project.
Yeah.
And, that's some of the stuff they're doing is basically continuing the work that Reagan started. But when you get Musk in there, it is just to a whole other drug field. And these people are on drugs. Like,
yeah, they are.
It is. It's not sane.
And I actually want to mention, like, especially with the Department of Education as a teacher, like, I think I want to clarify like what the Department of Education actually does, because I think like it doesn't get spelled out enough in terms of how important it is. I would say like, okay, if you're not a teacher, but if you went to a 4-year college or graduate school and you have like student loan debt, the way that you would have to deal with the Department of Education is that they're the ones like servicing student loan debt, right? So that's so. But for anyone in education, if you're a teacher, if you have kids and your kids go to school, if you yourself are a K through 12 student, right? The Department of Education, what it does is that, one, it provides like funding and support, particularly funding for special education services. So like, if you live in a community and you live in a school district where like there are a lot of kids who are special education, you can thank the Department of Education for providing extra funding for special education programs and services. So we basically gutting the Department of Education, like those students will be hurting, okay? Like they'll be negatively impacted by that. So there's that. And also probably the most important, crucial, not probably the most important, the special education is also important, but another important function of the Department of Ed that I think a lot of people will feel is funding for Title I schools. So for those of you who don't know, Title I schools are schools where a significant percentage of the student population are from low-income families. So when people say Title I schools, you're basically talking about schools in like a poor neighborhood, right? Like, so in some schools, let's say if they're not designated as Title I, there are, let's say, a lot of students who are kind of like Title I students, basically. And so that makes sure like, they get like free lunch and other services. And so, and when it comes to like low income schools, I think, obviously because of systemic racism, obviously black and other non-white students, like black and brown students, are disproportionately impacted by that. But it's not just black and brown students. It's also white students in rural areas and red states. So, like that's something like, especially, Trump and the Republicans and like, there is rural poverty, right? Like there are poor whites in rural areas who are living in living in rural areas, in red and conservative areas, but they're poor. Getting rid of the Department of Education would hurt them too, right? So it wouldn't just hurt poor black and brown students, it would also hurt poor white students in rural areas, because those schools, there are Title I schools in rural areas where it's predominantly white, so, which to me speaks for the need for some real class consciousness in this country that just doesn't, it's not there yet. I think it's starting to come up. It's starting to rise, I think. But I just think this country's not fully there yet. But that speaks to the need for class consciousness. And yeah, dismantling the Department of Education, it would hurt special education students and students from low-income families. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify that because I think that's important because I think like that doesn't I've noticed that like if someone's not a teacher or if they're not in education, like they may or may not be completely familiar with some important work that the Department of Education actually does and who would be impacted by it being dismantled, which now is being dismantled, and the one who will be doing the dismantling is fucking Linda McMahon, our Secretary of Education, who got her start in professional wrestling as a promoter.
Vince McMahon's wife, is that
yep mm-hmm yeah. yep America the Clown Show.
I hate saying Idiocracy is a documentary, but it is almost like they watched it and were like, yeah, we should do that. I mean, when you phrase it like that, Adam, why would we want to do that? We need to get those kids back in jobs, man. We're bringing back child labor. We're going back to when America was strong.
Right, yeah.
Besides, Musk got another rocket he needs to explode over the Caribbean. So, we can't be putting poor kids to school. Come on. That's not, I overall, there's just, I think MAGA does get high off its own supply. Like, they don't care about the long-term interests of the American project because they want what they want now. Yeah. Because they're pure products of America. And as William Carlos Williams said, the pure products of America tend to go crazy. So like you said, like we're moving away from like consumer-based capitalism to like subscription-based 21st century feudalism. And it's just the bureaucracy, it takes a long time to work through that, but that's what Doggy is for, to kind of speed up that process. Which is very bleak, but maybe in some less bleak news, Somalia.
Oh yeah, actually Somalia. This actually is a good transition. Actually, you know what? Now that I'm looking at the time, so I want to be kind of mindful of time and how much we have left to record. Because we try to keep these episodes like between an hour to an hour and a half. Actually, I'll bring up Somalia, and then what I'll want to bring up next is the racial wealth gap, and then close out with the relevance of Pan-Africanism, especially for a podcast like this. But so Trump has been essentially expanding the U.S. war in Somalia. So like last month, the United States Africa Command, so AFRICOM, conducted the first airstrikes in the country under the Trump administration. And the airstrikes were against apparently ISIS in Somalia. And then actually, in response to the attacks, Trump tweeted, "These killers..." Wait, excuse me. Hold on. Let me do it in Trump's voice. Hold on. "These killers who we found hiding in caves threatened the United States and our allies. We will find you and we will kill you. Okay? We will fucking kill you." He didn't say the fucking kill. But so, so there's like essentially an ISIS branch in Somalia. ISIS was formed. So I'm reading there's a really good article in Truthout that explains this. So ISIS in Somalia has grown in influence since it was formed in 2015 by a group of Al-Shabaab defectors. And Al-Shabaab was formed in 2007. So both of these groups, Al-Shabaab and ISIS in Somalia, were formed after 9/11. And to give people context, because I think now, like with where the chronologically where we're at with like the war on terror, it's kind of like we're no longer at the height of it during like the Bush and Obama years, but now it's sort of like, I think with this sort of the post 9/11 war on terror war apparatus is pretty much on autopilot at this point. So after 9/11, the U.S. passed this bill, the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, and it basically gave the executive branch and the president this wide authority to use lethal force against terrorist groups around the world, basically. Not just terrorist groups, but also countries harboring terrorism. That law is basically what inaugurated the war on terror. Bush's approach with the war on terror was largely more focused on the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obama, his approach was to focus less on large scale military operations, but to focus more on drone strikes and also direct action raids by special operations forces. And so the U.S. has launched drone strikes and airstrikes in Somalia, not as much as it has in Yemen and Pakistan. So Pakistan and Yemen were like, particularly during the Obama years, Pakistan and Yemen, that's where a lot of drone strikes were launched. But Somalia, there were drone strikes, airstrikes, and other forms of military action. But yeah, the United States has, I think, over the years been expanding its military footprint in Africa through AFRICOM. And so, like one of my my initial take from this is that I think like during the election, Trump kind of ran on, but obviously he's not implementing this as shown by this airstrike in Somalia. Trump kind of ran on like this right-wing isolationist tack and tried to make him seem like the peace president compared to Biden, especially with the war in Gaza. Israel's really not really a war. Israel's genocide in Gaza. Let me be clear about that. Israel's genocide in Gaza, aided and abetted by the United States with its military and financial support. Trump, ran as a peace candidate, but now that he's in office, he's doing the complete fucking opposite of that, right? This is very naked, kind of cruel imperialism. But yeah, like, so Trump has been launched these airstrikes in Somalia, and he's also loosened some of the restrictions when it's come to civilian casualties with drone strikes. To Biden's credit a little bit, drone strikes did decrease dramatically under Biden, but now Trump is he's bringing them back. He's particularly in Somalia. And I'm reading this book. I'm almost done with this book called The Dying Sahara by Jeremy Keenan, and he also, there's a book before it called The Dark Sahara. And his main point in that book is I just want to give some context to this. He doesn't write about Somalia in those books. He writes more about North Africa and North and Northwest Africa. So like particularly Algeria. That in The Dying Sahara is really interesting. He lays out that there were a lot of kind of terrorist attacks and kidnappings in Algeria of like European nationals, and these attacks and kidnappings essentially had the fingerprints of Algerian intelligence, specifically like the Algerian deep state, basically like individuals involved in it, training, just connections to it. And France and Europe knew about it. But essentially, like, there have been like these false flag terrorist attacks and kidnappings that have been used as an excuse to expand Europe's military interests in Africa, and also the United States military interests in Africa, particularly AFRICOM, right? And especially like the war on terror. The ethnic group, the Amazigh people, well, actually, Amazigh, they're more in North Africa. Really, the Tuareg or Tamashek people. Yeah, they've been, fighting for their own, basically self-determination for a while, but where they're at, particularly in the Sahel region, there's a shit ton of uranium, and guess who needs Africa's uranium? France, right? Because of nuclear power. So, I want to lay that out, and especially, and also with Al-Shabaab, like, Ethiopia invaded Somalia back in the early 2000s was support from the Bush administration. And it was in that context that Al-Shabaab emerged. So, the quote unquote like terrorism in Africa and the shit that's used as an excuse to expand the war on terror, a lot of it is like the result of like false flag operations and essentially blowback of U.S. foreign policy. So that is why this shit is still like, that's why like the U.S. has been striking, engaging in military actions in Somalia. And then there are U.S. drone bases in countries like Niger. That's to lay out some context for like what's going on in Africa, particularly Somalia, and what led up to it. And yeah, now with Trump in office, he is gleefully expanding the U.S. empire, basically continuing U.S. imperial interests and military actions in Somalia. So yeah, that's something to look forward to, I guess. But especially on a Pan-African podcast like this, is something we care about. So
and I will say, it's a bit of an odd look for the MAGA crew, because I know this growing up in Columbus, Ohio, where there's a large Somali population.
Right.
The MAGA people really hate Somalis because they're black and Muslim.
Yep.
And one would think that, they would not want to continue to destabilize. I mean, Somalia has basically been a wreck since, both of us have living memory. And I've been trying to think about, like, why is it in the U.S. strategic interest to just keep it permanently fucked up? It is I've heard the phrase like anarcho-colonialism to describe, sort of a nihilist approach of just like continue to dump weapons in an area and just prevent a functioning state from emerging. And I think that makes sense because before the 90s, like Somalia had Siad Barre was like the dictator for a few decades, and he was very brutal, but it was like a state. And being on we were talking about this before, and like being on the Red Sea, the Strait of Hormuz on the other side, that's a big shipping lane, and I think they just don't want, and it's right on the doorstep of Saudi Arabia, and I think they just don't want any like upstart nationalists, because there's a big sort of nationalist streak in Somalia. They don't want that, throwing their weight around. I mean, that's part of, the breakoff of Somaliland is, definitely a reaction to sort of the brutal campaigns that the dictator, that the Barre dictatorship did. And, it makes sense, but it is also in the context of like, if Somalia were ever like, yeah, if it ever got its shit together, quote unquote, like it would cause more problems, or it would be, it might go to China or whatever. We wouldn't be able to control it. And since there aren't any, significant resources that we can extract from it, it's just, I guess, better. And it's not like the Africa desk in the Pentagon is like the bottom bench. It's not, the quote unquote best and brightest minds don't get put there.
Yeah.
So it is just like the real fucking freaks. And
yeah.
And so, yeah, I guess that's all I can come up with, because no one really wants to explain like why after 30 years we're continuing to basically like not even pretend to have an interest. I guess we tried to sort of make it like, oh, well, yeah, Ethiopia, Africa take care of its own problems. But now we're just back at like, no, we're in here, we're going to run the show and keep it fucked up, because that's just what these countries are. They're just permanently at war with each other.
Yeah, and also, like, I mean, when it comes to the U.S. empire, I don't think the U.S. has really had like its own long-term Africa policy, because when it comes to like the larger global politics and imperialism, Africa has usually been like Europe's colonial backyard, like its playground, right? In the same way that like Latin America has usually been like the U.S. empire's playground, especially with the Monroe Doctrine, right? Like Africa serves a similar function that Latin America serves to the U.S. empire, basically. And so like the U.S. has had its own long-term interest when it comes to its foreign policy in Latin America. It never quite had one with Africa, whereas like with Europe, its long-term foreign policy dates back to the Berlin Conference of the 1880s, and the vast majority of those countries, with the exception of Somalia, with the exception of Ethiopia.
Yeah, Somalia was an Italian colony.
Yeah. With the exception of Ethiopia, like the vast majority of Africa was colonized by different European countries. I mean, the Congo by Belgium, most of West Africa, North and West Africa, France, Libya and Somalia, Italy. Britain colonized most of East Africa, and part of the reason why Britain colonized most of East Africa, in addition to like a handful, like some West African countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and I believe the Gambia. Cecil Rhodes, the railroad tycoon, he wanted a fucking railroad from Cape Town, South Africa to Cairo, Egypt. So that was part of the reason why the British colonized East Africa, was because Cecil Rhodes wanted his basically a fucking railroad from Egypt to South Africa. And then the Portuguese
Rhodes Scholarship.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a fucking Rhodes Scholarship. And then Portugal colonized Mozambique and Angola. So I think up to today, right? Like, countries like Britain and France, especially France, have had their own like long-term and deeper foreign policy interests in Africa, whereas the United States never directly colonized Africa the way that Europe did. So
other than Liberia,
right? Yeah. But like, so yeah, I think that's part of the reason why the U.S. never, in terms of the U.S. empire, like it didn't really pay attention to Africa. Although I think things did change with the War on Terror, in that the 9/11 kind of gave the United States a reason to pay attention to Africa, particularly like Somalia, particularly Somalia. So, I think we can kind of wrap up that topic and then talk briefly about the racial wealth gap, and then Pan-Africanism and wrap up there. Like we probably can.
Yeah, those kind of relate.
Yeah. And then probably go for another like maybe 15 minutes. Okay, so I read this article. This article came out last year. Okay, this is in the Brookings Institute. This is from January of last year. It says black wealth is increasing, but so is the racial wealth gap. So basically, over the past years, like total wealth has increased, but it has not led to a decrease in the racial wealth gap. If anything, it's gotten worse. So it says, according to the latest data from the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the nation's racial wealth gap increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. Between 2019 and 2022, median wealth increased by $51,800, but the racial wealth gap increased by $49,950, adding up to a total difference of $240,120 in wealth between the median white household and the median black household. Even though wealth increased across the board, the data discussed here shows that not all people are reaping the benefits. While housing equity increased for black households, other components to wealth building, such as corporate and business equity, did not, exacerbating the racial wealth gap. Centuries of discrimination in public policy, financial practices, and societal norms that limited black wealth accumulation have not been overcome and will require broad structural changes to rectify the long-lasting impact of inequality. And it shows like the breakdown. Median black wealth increased from $27,970 to $44,890, but continued to lag other racial groups. These are 2022 numbers. In 2022, median wealth was approximately $62,000 for non-white Latino or Hispanic households, $285,000 for white households, and $536,000 for Asian American households. In Asian American, that's like a large category, especially once you factor in wealth, because like within Asian Americans, like they have like the largest, I believe, like income gap. So you're gonna have like very low income Asians and very like filthy rich Asians. So so that data, I think, kind of gets skewed. So it actually says in parentheses, Asian American household wealth data was only provided for 2022, and therefore time series gaps will only show wealth data for the racial categories Black, Latino, or Hispanic, white, and other, which includes Asian American, Native American, and Pacific Islander wealth. Oh, okay, all right, because okay, yeah. Anyway, so, and it shows in this graph. Total household wealth grew in 2022, but white households still hold the vast majority. So like this graph, it showed that the second quarter of 2023, white households had a total of like almost $120 trillion in total household wealth, and then black household wealth is $6.53 trillion. This is like total wealth. So like 6.5 trillion total household wealth for black households compared to almost 120 trillion for white households. And it says, since 2010, the wealth disparity between black and white families has persistently expanded. From the very first survey of consumer finances in 1983, the smallest difference between black and white family wealth was $123,910 in 1992 and has steadily climbed since, peaking into 2022. And it also shows like, so the growth in black wealth has been driven by housing prices. So like, I think that basically what it means is like, it factors in like, black families getting married and like let's say buying homes, and some of them, like there's been a growth in like with the black middle class, but the most of black wealth is in home equity, and it's not really split up between other forms of wealth like business equity, stock, corporate equity, and and then other wealth, and also black household wealth is negative when it comes to liquid assets. White wealth is kind of split evenly with all these different 5 categories like other wealth, liquid assets, stock, let's see, stock, what else I'm looking? Oh, business equity, net housing wealth, and is showing. Yeah, and then I'm also looking at, I found like another thing. This is from the census. This is 2024. Okay, April 2024. This is from the census. It also shows like the racial wealth gap. And it shows like the distribution of household net worth by race, and white households, when it comes to distribution, like they tend to have household net worth of like 100,000 or more, and then they definitely white households definitely far outpace black households when it comes to household net worths of $1 million or more. And yeah, like white households tend to have like more assets at financial institutions, vehicles, home equity, stock. So like when I look at these numbers, I can go on and on, but I think you guys get the idea. The racial wealth gap has expanded. So even though like overall wealth has increased since the pandemic, the racial wealth gap is massive. And also like once, more boomers start dying, I would say like you're gonna see more of a racial wealth gap because, white millennials will inherit like a lot more intergenerational wealth than black millennials from their boomer parents. And so like actually wait, before I go on, like what do you think, Peter, about this racial wealth gap? Because I have my thoughts. I want to get your thoughts.
I mean, it makes sense. It does seem like overall, the sort of the general focus on Black America, in Black America, has been just sort of like, get your money and kind of keep your head down. And but it seems to, I think also just sort of the explosion of like Robin Hood and that kind of stuff. People are much more like plugged into the market these days, and I know like a lot more people, have investments are in the stock market, and so I can see that, and like the fucked up thing is that I'll be like, look, see, black wealth has gone up. There's nothing to complain about, but it's in the context of a massive reconsolidation of wealth, which happened during the pandemic. And the thing is that when the sort of boom and bust cycle and the structural contradictions of capitalism happen, and, whatever the next recession or whatever it is we're living through now, whenever that happens and wealth reconsolidates, black wealth is usually the first to get wiped out. That's what happened in 2008. And so it is perpetually like a game of catch up that will never, Black America will never achieve anything. I mean, white America was founded on having world controlling and world destroying wealth. And there's no way to ever, you're never going to be able to cake like that. So, I mean, yeah, as the rich get richer, it's always going to be white people that get the richest.
Yeah, and actually, my thoughts, which will actually tie into Pan-Africanism, and yeah, then we can close out. Like, well, tying it into like recent events, with Doge getting rid of like all these, public agencies, what really grew the black middle class were government jobs, especially like federal jobs, like jobs with the federal government, or even if not the federal government, like state government, local government, post office. Jobs like that are what grew the black middle class. That allowed, especially a lot of black families get out of poverty, right? So it allowed like black people to have a little bit of economic stability, and then get married, and then have kids, maybe buy a house, and maybe have a little bit to spend on like, a vacation here and there. Now, obviously, not the kind of wealth where it's like, like maybe spend on like a second house, or not the kind of wealth that would get you into like the upper class, right? Like where you can spend on a Ferrari or something like that. But you could, enough money where you can live like some middle class life. And by by Doge getting rid of a lot of federal agencies, that's going to mean like a lot of black people losing their jobs. And which I think would make the racial wealth gap even worse. The racial wealth gap and even the income gap. And what I'll also add is that the racial wealth gap itself, its historical roots is in slavery, because you're dealing with a population of people on one end, enslaved African people and their descendants, people who were enslaved for over 250 years, right? Which means several generations of working for free and not being able to pass down and accumulate intergenerational wealth. And also keep in mind, during slavery, a lot of families were separated. Like you would have like on a plantation, there'd be, children being born by an enslaved man and an enslaved woman, and they would have kids. And then, the likelihood that the mother would lose her kids, like let's say they get sold off or something, that was pretty common, right? So that also made, particularly passing down like cultural values a lot more difficult, right? And that would have also made, like, even though slaves weren't paid, like let's say if they were paid, it would have made passing down any kind of like inheritance down the bloodline a lot more difficult. So you're dealing with the fact that enslaved Africans, by the virtue of being slaves, were not paid, and families were separated. So you had 250 years of that, right? Meanwhile, white Americans, if their ancestors were slave owners, or even if their ancestors were not slave owners, like whatever time that their ancestors came, to America, either at some point between 1619 to 1865, with the end of the Civil War, their ancestors had a chance to work, get paid, and to be able to accumulate and pass down intergenerational wealth, right? So when it came to passing down intergenerational wealth, like white Americans got a head start by like 250 years. And then you had another 100 years of legalized racial discrimination in the name of Jim Crow, right? So there was that too. And then, a couple decades after Jim Crow, you've had like, very bad public policy when it comes to economics
and deindustrialization.
Deindustrialization, neoliberalism, and also the growth of mass incarceration, and the also racist housing policies that have existed like actually since Jim Crow, that pretty much relegated black people to lower income neighborhoods, and also like racist practices within the real estate market where, homes owned by black families are literally appraised at a lower value than the same home with a white family. So you've had slavery, legalized racial segregation, on top of like other policies that have been barriers for black people to accumulate wealth and basically reach parity with white Americans, right? So that racial wealth gap is not the result of white people working harder and then or even white people being smarter with money, because there are plenty of white people who like are shit when it comes to finances. So it's not about like knowing how to invest and budget and blah 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 blah. No, it is a result of centuries of slavery, legalized racial segregation, and other forms of systemic racism. So that is why that wealth gap exists. And here's where it ties into Pan-Africanism. And actually, I'll use this as like a way to sort of synthesize some of the stuff we talked about and then close out. Like Pan-Africanism, I think it's worth maybe even repeating this with episodes, is that it's really Pan-Africanism is the emphasis on strengthening ties and solidarity between all people of African descent around the globe. So fostering stronger ties culturally, economically, politically, etc., between people within the African diaspora and the African continent, right? That's Pan-Africanism. It's the highest form of black power, is Pan-Africanism. And so why do I think it's relevant here? Well, in the case of what we talked about in this episode, two reasons. One was Somalia and things going on in Africa. Africa is still our ancestral homeland, and what goes on in Africa is our problem. It's a problem of every person of African descent. So Africa's problems are the problems of black people globally. So whether or not you're African American, Jamaican, Afro-Brazilian, Black British, like wherever you are, like if you're a black person, wherever you are living outside of Africa in whatever part of the world, what goes on in Africa is our problem. So as an African American myself, obviously America's problems impact me. And obviously my relationship to America by lineage is because on both sides of my family, they were enslaved people from primarily West Africa. So, America's problems impact me because of that. I live in America, and I live in America because my ancestors were enslaved here. But at the same time, even though I, as an African American, do not live in Africa, Africa's problems are still my problems. Because Africa is still my ancestral homeland. That's where my ancestors were taken from. And what goes on in Africa has an impact on all people of African descent globally. So when I, read books like The Dying Sahara or read articles going about U.S. militarism in Somalia, I look at it from that perspective, that what goes on in Somalia is my problem, right? Africa's liberation and stability will impact all people of African descent globally. So there's that. Another reason why it ties in is because in terms of combating the racial wealth gap, I think, let's say if all descendants of enslaved Africans had stronger economic ties to Africa. So there's that. And let's say if, Europe didn't have its neo-colonial footprint in Africa, I actually think that would help close that racial wealth gap. Because on the one hand, it's like, okay, if white people had like this fucking 400-year head start, right, in accumulating intergenerational wealth, well, they're African people have a land, the continent of Africa, that's rich in resources, and if there were stronger economic ties collectively on the African continent and throughout the diaspora, and us being able to pool our wealth together, I actually think like that could help, like, you know, undermine that racial wealth gap. On top of, like, you know, the obvious fucking reparations we're owed. I'm not gonna forget that. But yeah, that is why I think Pan-Africanism remains relevant today, and I think it's a way, you know, if implemented correctly, could help people of African descent, black people, to close that racial wealth gap. Because, like, you know, I'm sure there's like a global racial wealth gap between whites and blacks globally, and it stems from the transatlantic slave trade and European colonization in Africa, right? So Pan-Africanism is relevant when it comes to actual black power and undermining the, like, systemic racial inequality. So that's why I think Pan-Africanism is relevant. And especially in times like now where we're at, like with this Trump administration, like how fucking like bleak things are. What I've noticed personally is that I think like there's a dearth of solutions in like left media and left media spaces. Like people are like, you know, like I've noticed have like the good analysis, right, and critiques. Like I'm noticing good critiques and good analysis, but when it comes to like, okay, how do you move forward? Like, what's the solution? Like, what does a better world look like? I've noticed that like even within left media spaces, like those spaces are pretty bereft of like a vision to move forward. The right has their vision; they have like a Project 2025, but like there's no left wing Project 2025, and I think, you know, the Project 2025 for black people globally is Pan-Africanism. So that's why I think it's relevant, especially in times like this, again, where things are just so fucking bleak. You know, like, you know, we do need answers. And for me, like, you know, this is why we have this podcast, is to not just like complain about why shit is fucked up, but, you know, to draw from history and use those lessons to see how we can like build a better future. Because if it's, you know, like we definitely need that, especially in times like these. So that's yeah.
I recall a quote from the Chappelle Show sketch Wu-Tang Financial, where he said, "You need to diversify your bonds," and I think that it makes sense for Black America as an economic project, because Black America would be the wealthiest Black country on the planet. That tying oneself to the American Atlanticist imperialist project is, I mean, as we just shown, it's not a winning strategy. You're always begging for crumbs, and Africa, you know, it is also very clear that, like, you know, as the climate crisis intensifies and that American imperialism is going through a form of retrenchment, like even sort of the you know, 2000s like NGO informed, like, you know, saving Africa through investment. It's like, ain't nobody got money. Doesn't seem like white people have money for that, but Africa still needs a lot of investment. There's still a lot of development, and it would seem to me that, like, instead of putting your money in fucking crypto, because that's really all that's left is like literal, you know, in the end state, in this stage of capitalism, it's like you're investing in literally nothing.
Right.
that it
Yeah.
would make, you know, it's not a financial planner, but it would make sense to me that figuring out vehicles to invest in the African continent would definitely pay back, and it isn't just like replicating capitalism, because fundamentally the system of global capitalism depends on Africa remaining permanently underdeveloped. So it is, I mean, it's not like you're just redoing capitalism. It is a different form of investment, but
Yeah.
it just, there, if Black America is to maintain its own identity, I think that in terms of long-term investment, Africa is kind of the place to put a lot of that wealth. And
Yeah.
I think that's all I got.
Yeah. Yeah. And even to add on to that, and then we can close out, like, that kind of investment it doesn't have to be like investing in the stock market, like that type of stuff. Although, like, African countries do have stock markets, so there is that. But basically my point is just seeing Africa as like part of a long-term future for the longevity of Black power, right? So and that could look like when I think of Pan-Africanism, right? It's not just like a one-way path to just repatriating to Africa. I see it as I think who was it? I think the artist Jadena put it in an interesting way a couple of years ago. He had an interview, and I'm kind of using his analogy. That's why I'm referencing him. I'm thinking of it as like a multi-lane highway going in both directions. So the Garvey approach was like just a highway that was just one direction going to Africa, and that's it. What I'm saying is that like it could be a Pan-Africanism in investment and development, and just like not like the kind of NGO capitalist form of investment and development, but more like investing like our emotional and political and economic energy, like that kind of an investment. It could look like, again, a multi-lane highway going in both directions, from the diaspora to Africa, and then Africa to the diaspora, and back and forth. And also, like, Pan-Africanism on the continent, looks like one form I've seen like people debate and be on the table and stuff be put on the table about this is fostering greater trade between African countries, right? So that's one form of it. You could apply that same approach when it comes to the diaspora, like fostering trade and doing business and organizing together. Like when I think of an investment in Africa, I mean, I'm really thinking of like more how people of African descent collectively organize among each other, politically, economically, socially, culturally, like that kind of organization and investment. Like how people of African descent work together on a political level, economic level, because there are some real political interests that people of African descent globally have, right? And politically, that could look like actual Pan-African political parties that organize in different chapters around the world and organize, across borders, right? So I just want to say that we could flesh it out even more, like, but you know what? I'll save that for another episode because I think we're at like an hour and a half, and so we should probably start wrapping up. Do you have any final thoughts, Peter? Or
no, you basically said it.
Okay, cool. All right, so yeah, thank you everyone. If you like this episode, and if you want access to bonus content, $5 a month, patreon.com/Sankara Hours, and obviously in our show notes you can see all our links and our socials. But the best way to kind of see everything, keep up to date, go to our website, realsankarhours.org. It's very straightforward website where, you see the description and the mission of the show, and then like links to where to find us. And also, before I forget, we have a YouTube channel. So we're going to be uploading more episodes on YouTube. And so we've been uploading our long back catalog of older episodes onto YouTube. So we do have a YouTube channel, so you can kind of follow us there. But best way to keep up to date with our episodes is usually Patreon and Spotify, SoundCloud, and all that stuff. But yeah, so that's where to find us. And like I said, if you want access to bonus content, $5 a month, you can become a patron on our Patreon at patreon.com/realsankarhours. Anyway, we've talked enough. That's it on our end. Keep the faith.
Stay dangerous.
All right, peace out.
Bye.